All you need is just a computer and Ableton. There's one more peripheral that you're going to need, and that's something like this. It's called an audio interface. This one's made by PreSonus. It's the Studio 26. This is just a 2-channel USB interface, so you can see it's got 2 inputs on the front. You can plug in an XLR microphone or a 1/4-inch cable into each one of these. And it's got 4 outputs on the back and a headphone out. So that's why I like this. Again, it's USB bus powered. You don't have to run power to the unit. It'll just run off of the USB cable, go into your computer. So,
first things first, you need tracks. So these guys are all MIDI tracks. Guitar or any instrument is audio track. So you kind of need to prepare what you're going to play, or at least what sounds you want to use, and then set up your tracks. Here we've got a piano sound, we've got a pad sound, we've got a bass sound. They're all MIDI tracks. So, I mean, you can play that in, and then afterwards, if you want to change the sound, you can always do that afterwards, but you need these tracks to begin with.
So now on each of these channels, I've dragged over an Ableton plugin called Looper. It's a free plugin, and it already comes with Ableton Live, so you don't need to buy anything else. And essentially, each one of these channels is now its own looper pedal, each with its own record, play, stop, and overdub functions. So at this point, I can just press record on any of these plugins and the looping begins.
So if you look at the interface of the looper, you'll see how many bars you want the loops to be. For example, I choose 1 bar, and the quantization of the looper, and the song control and tempo control. And here you have what would you like the looper to do after a few bars. After 1 bar, I want it to go to overdub or to play.
But there is one last thing that we need to do before we get going, and that's MIDI mapping our loop control buttons. So click on this MIDI button up here in the right-hand corner, and you'll see that everything on the screen turns purple. And this is really cool. Ableton allows you to assign any of these purple buttons to a hardware button or hardware controller on your MIDI device, if you have one. So if you're using a MIDI foot pedal, well, I can assign the record button of this looper plugin to any button on my foot pedal. So let's just go ahead and choose this one here. And then I'll do the same for each channel.
And in Drum Rack, you can actually open each sample as an individual channel like that. And I'm just going to place the looper on each channel. And now I want to activate all of them at the same time, so I can do with the keyboard Command K, because I just want to map it to a key on my keyboard. Let's just use V. I don't know why. In this way, I can make exactly the same loop, but now I will have control because I have 3 individual loopers for each channel. So I'm able to control the mix.
Fast, so I've got a clock. I'm arming my first track, and because my quantization is to a bar, if my clock is running, all I have to do is hit this, this record clip button right here, any point between 1 and 4 counts, and on the downbeat of the next count, it's going to start recording, okay? And then I also want to musically try to hit that on the way out so that it loops perfectly. So that's the concept.
Put it in there, and then go on here, where it says underneath loop, it says length. And I'm just going to make this 4 bars quickly. Right. And then let's see what happens. So I can hear the click. I'm going to press record, and let's see. Yeah, here we go. And it's looped my little chord progression 4 bars long, and so nice.
Go to edit, record quantization, and you can set however you want it to quantize there. You play, it quantizes, it loops.
Another thing to point out maybe is you always have to have the track or the sound that you want to be playing on record arm. So you see that little red button here, or on the launchpad. You can see it being red here as well. If I want to now actually loop multiple different tracks, I'm going to do some prep work here. So what I'm going to do is delete this again and just create a bunch of 4-bar loops. So basically here, that's currently 1 bar, change it to 4 bars. Exactly as you did before,
MIDI
right?
keyboard. And then the other mappings are done 1, 2, 3 right here on the what's known as the track launch button, which if the track is selected to ARM and there's no clip in that area, it'll start recording that clip. If there is a clip in that area, it'll play that.
And we've got a loop that's spread out over many tracks and layers. And again, the reason why I like to do this is because now I can do some mixing and some processing. If the groove is too loud, well, I don't have to worry about re-recording it. I can just pull it down with this fader right here. If the chords are too soft, if I played them too quietly now that everything's all stacked up, well, I can just bring up the volume by doing this. And since everything is going over to this master fader right here on the right, well, now I can add plugins like EQ to morph the sound of everything coming from Ableton. Or I can even place these plugins on specific channels themselves for individual processing. So now I just jam out, have fun, and tweak away. Somewhere. And then from there, just click on this audio tab here on the left, and then look for these two drop-down menus labeled Audio Input Device and Audio Output Device. You'll need to select your interface that you just plugged in for both if you want to use it for inputs and for outputs. And then once you've selected your interface, you just need to set up your I/O routing for the interface that you plugged in. So I recommend creating a mono input for your bass and then a mono output that's going to go to your amplifier like this. Okay, next we need to set our sampling rate to either 44.1 or 48K, whichever you prefer, but there's really no reason to go any higher. Also, be sure to set your buffer size on the higher side, maybe at 512 or 1024 samples. Now, normally a buffer size this high would incur some latency when playing live instruments, but that's not really going to affect us in this case, and I'll explain why. The way that I do this without incurring any latency is by using my effects loop on my bass amp. So basically, I plug my bass into the bass amp, and therefore I'm always monitoring directly from the amp. No digital conversions, no latency whatsoever. Now that signal goes from my amp to this interface where all of the digital looping, and processing happens, and then goes back to the amp via the effects return and then gets blended in to my signal chain. So since I'm monitoring in real time with the amp and the laptop is just basically kicking me playback, there's no need to worry about latency at all. So set that buffer size as high as you want. Okay, so let's close out of this window and set up our inputs and outputs for this session. We'll start by plugging in a cable to the effects loop send from your amp, and the other end of that cable is going to go in to channel 1 on your interface. And then here in Ableton Live, in this Audio From tab, for each channel of your bass, just select channel 1, since that's where you just plugged your bass in. Next, plug in a cable to the effects loop return on your amp and send the other end of that to the left output channel or channel 1 output on your interface. On most interfaces, the left output is channel 1 and the right output is channel 2. Then come over here to the master output of this Ableton session and select channel 1 or that left channel output, however it's labeled in your I/O routing base. Now, if you want to, you can plug in some MIDI peripherals as well, so you can control VST instruments or the different looper functions with your hands and feet. So I've got a Keylab 25 for my keyboard sounds, and this Korg pad control over here for the drums. And then I use this Akai APC 40 for all of its mixing features. Now, none of this stuff is necessary, but I just thought it was cool to incorporate. So if you have any MIDI peripherals and you would like to use them, then you just have one additional step to take. Go back to this Preferences menu over here and click on the MIDI tab. Just be sure to enable all of these MIDI controllers and see that they're all showing up. Then just go to the various channels in this session and assign them to a specific MIDI controller. So for instance, my pad control can only control this drum VST right here. I don't have to worry about accidentally hitting piano notes or anything like that, because you can see that VST instrument is only being controlled by the Keylab 25 over here.